Two elite Delta Force operators mocked an old man's faded tattoo in a quiet diner. They thought they were exposing a fraud, but the moment the highest-ranking general in U.S. Special Operations walked in, saluted the old man, and revealed the same tattoo on his own arm, which changed everything in a way no one expected. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Under the harsh glow of the diner's flickering light, quiet old man named Glenn Dalton stirred his coffee like it was the last ritual in a long-forgotten religion. His weathered hand steady despite the years carved into his skin, and the two men who loomed over his table didn't see a veteran, didn't see a man who once walked through fire and shadow. They saw a relic, a prop, an old-timer with a strange tattoo faded into the parchment of his forearm, and one of them, broad-shouldered and brimming with smugness, leaned in with a smirk and said, "That ain't come free with a box of cornflakes, Grandpa?" As his buddy chuckled under his breath, not noticing how the diner just outside Fort Brenton had gone utterly silent except for the coffee brewing behind the counter. Because everyone who knew Glenn knew better than to poke the past he never spoke of. But these two, fresh out of a classified deployment and drunk on their own legend, kept pressing, pointing at the old tattoo, a serpent coiled into a circle with a star at its heart, and mocking it like it meant nothing, like it wasn't inked with fire in places no map admitted existed. And Glenn didn't flinch, didn't even blink, just kept sipping his coffee, as though he was still deciding whether they were worth his time or memory, until one of them, Cutler, jabbed a finger at the mark and said, "You play soldier in your youth or just peel potatoes for real ones?" And still, Glenn didn't respond with anger, only with a sigh that echoed like the last note of a funeral song, eyes drifting to the window where rain began tapping like distant rotor blades. The years fell away as he remembered jungle air thick with death, the cries of men too young to die, and that one night when 5 shadows crawled out of a hell they were never meant to survive, when a needle made of bamboo and a vow made in silence bound them tighter than blood. And then Cutler made the mistake, the one no one ever comes back from. He tapped the tattoo with the back of his hand like swatting dust off an old book. And just like that, Glenn was back in the mud, his hands pressed against the bleeding side of a boy named Myers, the smell of napalm still fresh in his lungs. And when he blinked again, the diner had returned, and Cutler was still talking, still laughing, still clueless. But Sarah, the waitress, wasn't. She had seen it all, had served Glenn pancakes every Tuesday for 8 years, had noticed how he always faced the door, and never sat with his back exposed. And while Cutler kept talking, Sarah slipped away, ducked into the office behind the kitchen, and called the one number she hoped she'd never need, whispering into the line to her cousin on base, "There's a man here, Glenn Dalton, and 2 of your boys are about to do something very stupid." And when she described the tattoo, the voice on the other end went dead silent before saying, "Don't let them leave." And then the call ended. And outside the diner the world began to shift, because within 12 minutes the rumble of 3 black Suburbans shattered the morning calm, the kind of motorcade that didn't roll out for anything less than a national security threat or a 4-star general. And when they stopped, the doors opened in perfect rhythm, like choreography built from muscle memory and war. And the first man out was the one whose shadow made younger men forget how to breathe. General Malcolm Rourke, head of Joint Special Operations Command, walked straight into the diner without removing his gloves, his eyes cutting through the room like a scalpel until they found Glenn. And the moment his eyes fell on the old man, he snapped to attention, clicked his heels, and saluted in front of every mouth hanging open. And only then did he speak, not to the staff, not to the patrons, not even to Cutler and Reyes, who now stood like boys caught stealing from church. but to Glenn, softly, reverently. "You should have called me first, Dalton." And Glenn just chuckled and said, "You wouldn't have come for coffee." And Rourke smiled with something like sorrow before turning to Cutler and asking with a voice that carried the weight of classified wars, "Is this the man you harassed?" And Cutler, now pale as drywall, couldn't speak, only nodded. And Rourke rolled up his sleeve in silence, revealing the exact same tattoo. The ink still fresh compared to Glenn's, but unmistakable. And the room exhaled a collective gasp as the story unspooled in Rourke's voice. About Project Sentinel. About 5 men sent where no mission logs exist. About the operation buried beneath 7 levels of clearance. And about how Glenn Dalton had carried his bleeding body for 3 days through jungle so thick it swallowed sound, and that only 2 men bore the tattoo now. The mark of those who never broke, never quit, and never left anyone behind. And Rourke stepped close to Cutler and Reyes and said, "You wear the gear those men pioneered. You walked the halls they built, and you mocked one of them like he was nothing." And his voice didn't rise, but the gravity of it crushed both men until they seemed to shrink inside their uniforms. And then he turned to Glenn and asked if he could sit. And they did. 2 legends in a cracked vinyl booth in a small-town diner while the world stood still. And Cutler, stripped of his swagger, reassigned within the week, found himself behind a desk helping set up the new legacy program Rourke launched across every Tier 1 school, where veterans like Glenn came in to teach the quiet truths behind the medals and missions. And every class began the same way, with silence and the story of a serpent eating its tail, a circle without end, and a star for every man who didn't come home. And 3 years later, Cutler saw Glenn again at a hardware store, and approached with the weight of regret, his voice softer than it had ever been, offering a trembling apology. And Glenn didn't say much, just shook his hand and said, "Try not to forget what you learned." And that was it. No speeches, no grudges, just a quiet reminder that respect isn't demanded. It's earned, and the ones who've seen the worst often say the least, because they know silence sometimes carries the heaviest truth of all.